Hello. So, what Sir Chuck and I have been working on is sort of our favorite books of all time. And as we were kind of putting that together, I found myself like putting in comic books and like epic poems and plays and short story collections and all these other things. And then it became very, very hard to cut down to 100. Um, and so he had said, well, why don't we just do like best comics separately? So I had just done my top 10 comic series, and this is essentially my top 30 non-novels. And I shouldn't 100% say novels because on my top 100, I do have some children's books, which aren't really novels. I mean, they're very short, but essentially I want to say nonfiction, but I mean, there are fiction in here, but like plays, epic poems, short story collections, graphic novels, memoirs, and nonfiction. So things that you wouldn't put in your like traditional fiction story section. So, I mean, again, non-novels, and my top 100 will be my top 100 novels, with the idea being that some of them are children's books, so they're, I wouldn't call them novels as much as short books, but, they are complete, I guess, stories in one. So, novels, novellas, and children's books, I guess. So this is anything that's not those. All right, and again, when it comes to graphic novels, I did like comic series that were like longer running series. This is more, they were either published as graphic novels, they were published as comic series, but as like a short run meant to be sort of a graphic novel. So I put them in groups of 3 just because I don't want to spend like a ton of time on each one, because obviously it would take forever to talk about 30 books. And then when I get to like my 100 books, I'm going to do those 2 at a time in groups of 20. So I think I'm going to have like essentially 5 parts to that, because I mean, obviously no one wants to sit through 100 books. So, but I do think, I want to give at least a little explanation as to why they're on the list. And I mean, this goes more for like my books, because obviously there's different reasons for some of these. But one of the things is, my criteria is essentially, did I enjoy it? But also, how much it has stuck with me, how much it impacted me, if it like changed something in like my perspective. So there's things in here, that you might be like, well, that's not as good as this thing. And you might be right. But, again, and I might agree with you that it may not be technically one of the best of its kind, but it's just something that for me is my favorite for whatever reason. So, okay. So without further ado, we'll get into them because this is going to take a little bit. So the first 3, and I guess, so it'd be 30, 29, and 28, would be The Laramie Project by Moises Kaufman and the theater project that he worked with. Tweak by Nick Sheff, and No Exit by Sartre. So the Laramie Project, if you're not familiar with it, is actually a play that was written about the murder of Matthew Shepard. And the Laramie Project book is kind of about writing the play. So it's parts of the play, but it's also about performing the play, getting the information, trying to like gather information about what actually happened. And obviously the story of Matthew Shepard is very, very sad, to begin with. And I always thought it was like really well done at being able to sort of walk the line. I mean, obviously not necessarily in terms of like the people who did it. Although even that, I don't think they were like completely unsympathetic to the situation. But I mean, obviously, they murdered somebody, so you're not supposed to really like them. But I thought, a lot of what goes on, a lot of the context of Matthew Shepard's murder is a lot of cultural and social issues. And I thought that they did a really good job of kind of addressing that without making anyone look, bad necessarily. I mean, again, it looks a little ignorant and so on, but, I feel like there's a way they could have done this in a way that was like almost an attack on a community. And I feel like they think they did a good job, given that this did happen in this community. So you can't pretend like it wasn't part of their community. But I thought they managed to be very like journalistic in this and kind of tell you the story. It's sad, it's impactful, but in a way where you could read it and not just like, it's not black and white necessarily. I mean, again, it's a hate crime. It's one of the first hate crimes, really. And times were a little different and so on, but it's a really beautiful story about a horrible crime and a person who honestly had their life cut way too short and seemed like he probably was a really wonderful person. So it's very sad. Play is really amazing if you haven't seen it. So, but if you don't have a chance to see the play or haven't read the play, definitely try to check out the book, because it's the play, but like I said, it's also the memoirs and as well. So it's really interesting how this is put together. Tweak is also a memoir, and this is about Nick Sheff's struggle with addiction. And a lot of people knew the movie Beautiful Boy, which was actually the memoir from his father's perspective. And what I really thought was interesting about Tweak is it makes it understandable. Like, if you don't know anyone with addiction, and it can be frustrating, if you do know somebody, obviously it can be frustrating. But what was interesting about reading it is like how frustrated his friends and family and loved ones are about his addiction, how frustrated you're getting as a reader reading about the things he's doing. But what I thought was so interesting is he's frustrated too, and you can see like he doesn't want to be an addict and he can't stop, and it really puts you in the mindset of understanding, like, obviously it's frustrating, but why it's so hard when someone succumbs to addiction to break free from that. And so I'm pretty sure in real life he relapsed a few times after writing this too, and I think he's totally sober now. But either way, I mean, it's a really interesting look at how someone ends up being an addict. And again, a lot of times people just like, oh, it was their family life. I was like, but that's what's so interesting about this is like, he didn't necessarily have a reason. His life was from the outside pretty like stable and normal. And things happen. And it was just a really interesting look. Because I think it's easy to write it off, if you haven't been affected by addiction. It can be very easy to write off addicts and just be like, well, it's their own problem. And so I think this gives you a very empathetic look if you aren't naturally empathetic to that. And if you are, obviously, it's just even more intriguing just, to read. So, and then No Exit is obviously a famous existentialist play. This is just something that has always stuck with me. I think I read this very young. I want to say like 7th or 8th grade. I just read it on my own, and like, obviously, as I got older, I understood it more and appreciated it more, but I always thought it was just, like, so many things I think back to this play. The idea of, like, what is hell, what is heaven, what is life, so, very existentialist story. So my next set is Nickel and Dimed, Freakonomics, and Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And Nickel and Dimed, I think I mentioned this previously in another tag about a book that changed your perspective. And what Nickel and Dimed is a look at it. It's a journalist who basically lives on minimum wage. She goes and works minimum wage jobs in different areas in the U.S. and tries to kind of be like, could I live on this? What if there was a medical emergency? What like would happen? How easy would it be for me to go from perfectly fine to essentially like living on the street because of one little thing. And it's also like the people she meets along the way who aren't really doing this obviously as an experiment, and this is their life. And so not only is it just a really interesting look at class structure in America, I think it's an empathetic look at, a lot of times, again, people tend to be like, not my problem. They put themselves there as if like someone's like choosing to not have any money. And it's a very interesting kind of like there, but for the grace of, God, go I, kind of perspective is that like any of us really, no matter like, oh, I'm a billionaire. I mean, okay, fine. Maybe Elon Musk would never be in this situation. But he's got his own issues. but for most of us, all it would really take is one really awful thing to happen. And it's not that easy. You can see how quickly of a downward slide it would be. And once you get into sort of that, that life in that situation, how hard it is to get back out, and how the resources really are not there for people. And so, I mean, unfortunately, I think this was written like 20 years ago almost, and I mean, we're just getting worse so it's kind of frustrating, but it is a really interesting look if that class structure and, poverty and wealth disparity, if that interests you. I mean, probably should interest everybody because, it's something that's a major issue. And then the middle one is Freakonomics. And the reason I like this is, I think, like the first, like, real nonfiction I read that wasn't like a memoir. I mean, it probably wasn't, but, I think it was early. And I just thought it was so much fun. And it's really hard, I think, to talk about things like economics and, supply and demand and risk management and just all these like sort of business concepts and economic concepts and social concepts, and to explain them in a way that is relatable to like the average person. And so this was just a really interesting look at all of these sort of social, cultural, and economic things that have affected and led to change in our society, but really told in a way that's so compelling that you just can't put it down, and then you just want to share it with everybody. So, I mean, the idea that, like, everybody's getting excited about a book on economics, I think that tells you everything you need to know, how good it is. And then Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, these collections I just loved when I was a kid. I mean, these were the ultimate, right? And, like, going when you went camping or you had a sleepover, you gathered a couple of these around and everybody passed them around and told stories. And, I mean, the stories, most of them are super cheesy. Some of them are even meant to be cheesy and funny. The scary ones aren't very scary anymore, but they're your classic urban legends and folktales and horror stories. So, I mean, if you haven't read the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, there was a movie version, and it wasn't that bad, actually. I thought it would be terrible, but if you haven't read these, I mean, again, they're not going to necessarily scare you if you go read them now, because they're meant for, for obviously a younger audience, but it's still kind of pretty like foundational type of book, so definitely worth like checking out if you haven't read them. Next set is The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell, Our Town by Thornton Wilder, and Into the Wild by John Krakauer. So The Power of Myth by Campbell, I mean, I'll be honest, like, it's not a super exciting read. It's more just one of those things that as you're reading it, you're seeing how many elements of stories cross over across like cultures, across time periods, and how storytelling, although the concept, I mean, the concept of storytelling hasn't evolved, but although what we talk about may have evolved and our world has evolved, and even the media in which we tell stories has evolved, the actual stories are kind of the same. Like, we're still telling the hero's journey, and that's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. That's also Joseph Campbell. We're still telling the hero's journey stories. We're still telling creation myths. And it's just really interesting how, like, mythology gets sort of adapted over time and just, like, integrated into, like, the next culture and then part of their mythology, and they just kind of mix over time. So while, like I said, it's not necessarily the most exciting, fun read, I mean, it's definitely very academic, it's so foundational to, like, understanding the concepts of mythology and, how they recur, that it's just, I mean, it needs to be read. It's just great. And I think Joseph Campbell is, I mean, he's so critical to understanding, like, storytelling. And then Our Town, it's funny because I saw this play when I was really young. I mean, 6th grade maybe. And I thought it was cute, and it was, it was like everybody's favorite play because it was sweet. And I grew up in New England too, so it's like a small New England town, and it's kind of like sweet and innocent. But as I got older, like, what I find interesting about Our Town is that it's still not dark, and I mean, it's definitely a lighthearted story, but it's, as you kind of read it, as you get older, you're like, I don't know that this, like, Grover's Corners exists. It's more of an idealized nostalgia. And, I don't know if that was Thornton Wilder's point, but I mean, some of his other stuff is a little more out there. So I feel like, it's not just about like this town. It's kind of, I mean, it's our town. And I kind of do think it's meant to be like kind of everybody's town, in the nostalgic pieces of like childhood and adulthood and the stages of your life. And I think there's a lot more depth to this play than, you may see at first glance or on the surface. And so it's way better than, I went through a period of time where I was like, oh, our town. But I've kind of like come back into like really enjoying it and seeing it in a different way. And then Into the Wild, I mean, obviously it was a great movie too. But John Krakauer is just really good at making, nonfiction feel like a narrative work of fiction, even though it's not. And, what I actually really like about Into the Wild is I kind of feel like the best situation is to watch the movie and read the book, in whichever order. But because, like, in the movie, I think they, like, romanticize a lot of, like, Christopher McCandless's life and, kind of all the stuff that happened. I mean, it's not totally perfect, obviously, but the book is a lot harsher. But I think when you kind of bring the two together, you get, because we don't get his perspective, obviously, because, well, I'm not going to spoil it, but you don't get McCandless's perspective in Into the Wild. But in the movie, I mean, obviously it's written to give some of his perspective, even though it's, based on other people's perspectives of his perspective. But, because there's an actor playing him and you get to kind of experience some of the things that were like driving him. I feel like it combined, they give you like an even fuller story. But I do think, if you've only seen the movie, you should probably read the book because it's definitely a little idealized. And, I think the book gives you like a lot of like, what was going on, especially from like his sister's perspective. I think she was one of the ones that, she kind of went through a lot as a result of what, his life. So the next ones are the Martian Chronicles by Bradbury, the Crucible by Arthur Miller, and the Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester. So, I mean, there's not a whole lot to say. Ray Bradbury's short story collections are amazing. Martian Chronicles is a bunch of stories set, on Mars or in space. My favorite in this is Usher 2, which is a retelling of The Fall of the House of Usher. If you haven't read it, just go read it. It's amazing. It's like, 8 pages. Find it, read it. Obviously, it helps if you've read any Poe, because it's all like references to Poe short stories. But if you like Poe and you like Bradbury, you need to read Usher too. That's all I gotta say from Martian Chronicles. The Crucible by Arthur Miller. I mean, it's the Crucible. I grew up in Massachusetts. Like, I'm not allowed to not like have something about the Salem witch trials on my list. I've had like Salem drilled into my head since I was a child. So, and I think, the Crucible does a really good job. Obviously, it is very fictionalized. It was, political too. He was making some social commentary. So he was using Salem as sort of like a foundation to say something else. And I would say, look at other things about Salem. But, it's still really great. And the characters are interesting. And then The Professor and the Madman is, it's going to sound ridiculous, but it is a super compelling story about creating the Oxford English Dictionary. And basically, they put out, when they were putting together the Oxford English Dictionary, they put out requests for essentially people to help them, gather all the words and like write up the definitions. And so this professor, this Oxford professor, who's, a linguist and, studying language, one of his top contributors was this completely insane man locked up in this asylum at the time who had like murdered people, and it's just absolutely off the wall. Like, if you read this and didn't know it was nonfiction and thought it was just like a novel, you would be like, this writer is ridiculous. There's no way this would happen. That's why I think it's just so compelling, because it's just such a weird story. It's very much a stranger than fiction kind of, truth is stranger than fiction kind of thing. So it's only like 200 and something pages. Like, if you haven't read The Professor and the Madman, go read it. It is off the wall, super interesting. Just, you've not read anything like it. I could say that. Next set is 9 Stories by J.D. Salinger, Watchmen, and Zoo Stories. So 9 Stories, I would put 9 Stories higher because one of the short stories, Perfect Day for Banana Fish, is, I think, probably one of, if not my favorite short story of all time. And Teddy is also up there. But the rest of them are just kind of like okay. None of them are really bad. There's a couple that are good. I think there might be one that I didn't like. But the thing is, it's so hard to rate short story collections. And so because most of them are like middle of the road, I put it here. But I will say, like, those 2 stories stand out so much. And Perfect Day for Banana Fish is just absolutely amazing. And then Watchmen, obviously, I mean, Time Magazine named it one of the best 100 novels of all time. Watchmen was a weird one for me because I didn't like it when I started reading it, and I was just, like, so bored. And I was like, is this going to get interesting? And then at the end, I was like, oh, wow, that was amazing. I loved it. So, yeah, I mean, it's incredible, and especially if you're, like, into superhero comics. I'm not, and I ended up loving it, but, if you are into superhero comics, you'll probably like it even more. And then Zoo Story is a short one-act play by Edward Albee. It's just about these 2 guys on a bench talking about going to the zoo. It's completely weird. If you don't know Edward Albee, I mean, all his stuff is really weird. But I love Zoo Story. I read it in high school in my acting and theater class. And it's always been, like, one of my favorite plays. So it is a short play. And like I said, it's like 2 guys, so it's not really... You're probably not going to see it get performed too often, unless you see it in, like, a sort of festival or anything. But it's hilarious. You can definitely read it, though, so even if you don't get to see it performed. And then the next set is 3 memoirs, basically. Glass Castle, Angela's Ashes, and the Little House on the Prairie series. So Glass Castle is a memoir about a girl growing up, like, her parents were, like, running from debt collectors, and they were living sort of, like, in the middle of nowhere and trying to, like, live without being found. And, they lived in poverty and all these things happened, but then it's, like, her kind of, like, looking back, as she, like, gets away from that life to try to, like, come to terms with, like, loving her parents, but also hating them for a lot of, like, things that happened growing up. And she does a really good job, I feel like, of making you really love her family, but also hate them, and just be like, this seems abusive, but then also, like, you can kind of get why she doesn't see it as abusive, but she also does. It's just a fantastic memoir. And then Angela's Ashes, also a fantastic memoir, just about growing up in Ireland. It's kind of, and it's funny, but it's dark funny. I mean, it's Irish, but it's like, there's this one scene, it reminds me, like, there's this one part where he talks about how, like, everybody's babies keep dying in the neighborhood, and then at one point, and then, like, or their kids keep dying, and he says, like, how a bunch of the dads go to the pub and drink a toast so that nobody else dies, and then, of course, the next part, like, there's not even the next chapter, there's, like, a break, and then it's, like, it didn't help. And then it's, like, the next person who died. And it's like, not funny, obviously, that all these people are dying. But he very much has that, like, dark gallows humor, which is probably, like, an Irish thing, I think. But, yeah, it's really interesting. And, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you're Irish, maybe it's not as interesting. But it was interesting to me because I'm not Irish. And then Little House on the Prairie, I mean, again, I know it's, now it's a little, like, is it, like, sanitized? I mean, is it honest, accurate, but it is her version of, like, growing up, during this time, and I just loved him because I used to read him with my dad, so I'm going to always love them no matter what. All right, my next set, and now we're getting into my, like, absolute favorites, so, and this would be 12, so 12, 11, and 10, yeah. So 12 is Equus. I love this play. It's super messed up. If you Yes, it's the play that Harry Potter was naked in, if that's all you know about it, but it's actually a really good play. Um, like, there's like, and it's not about a guy having sex with horses, because that's, whenever I would mention it, people are like, it's not the one where like Harry Potter has sex with a horse. And like, first of all, it's not about sex with a horse. Um, it is about sexuality, and it is about horses. And the guy, there's definitely some like weirdness going on there, but yeah, I mean, just read it. It's hard to explain. It's, you know, you just gotta read it. But no one's having sex with horses, I promise. Um, and then the middle one is Ray Bradbury's Illustrated Man. Ray Bradbury is showing up a lot on my list, I'm realizing. But Illustrated Man was, I think, the first short story collection I really read. And I read it in school, and I just thought it was so cool. Like, the frame story was really neat, where, like, the tattoos were each moving and telling stories. And then, obviously, the stories in here are great. And then Persepolis, which is a graphic novel memoir about her life growing up during the Iranian Revolution. And obviously, you know, just interesting. It's a cultural perspective you don't get a lot of. And then, you know, it's really well written, too. The character's so funny and engaging and just really very likable. All right, so then in my top 9, we have 9 being Paradise Lost, which, I mean, what is there to say? Lucifer falls from heaven. It's super tragic. He's, like, portrayed as a hero, even though, like, I'm not sure Milton was, like, necessarily thinking of Lucifer as a hero, but he comes across as sort of heroic, anti-heroic, Byronic hero, I guess, even though, you know, there wasn't a Byron yet. And then, obviously, you know, tempting Adam and Eve and everything else. But just beautifully written. Some of the most, like, influential poetry. I guess this is a poem. Yeah, this is a poem, right. But some of the most influential poetry of all time, most influential storytelling of all time, and just beautifully done. You know, I read it one summer, and I mean, I don't know, my husband was like, you're just reading Paradise Lost for fun right now, huh? But it's really great. It's not something that feels like an old, you know, 17th century poem. And then V for Vendetta, which is again a graphic novel, dystopian, like sort of fight the man. You know, obviously at the time it was commentary on Margaret Thatcher, but you know, it's also about fascism in general, and just yeah, it's just great, anti-government kind of stuff, but excellent. Great movie, too. And then Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's an epic poem by Coleridge. You might have guessed I like Coleridge. You know, it's where I get the name. Big fan of him. And Rime of the Ancient Mariner is just absolutely stunning. Also, some of the most famous lines in poetry, and then also, like, the story, way ahead of its time, you know, kind of commentary about our place in nature and man's arrogance. And, you know, it's kind of like if you read this with Frankenstein and Moby Dick and all those, like, romantics, you know, the romantics were definitely very, very worried about the future of the Industrial Revolution, and, you know, just, they're all a bunch of Jeff Goldblums, you know, just because you can doesn't mean you should, or whatever, from Jurassic Park. But, you know, how far do we take things, and, like, you know, if man's arrogance in thinking that they control nature, and, you know, this is where you get the albatross around the neck, so, I mean, pretty famous reference. Yeah, and if you haven't read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, it's a poem, go read it. Like, it's long, but it's not that long. I mean, you know, you can handle it. So, last 6. All right, so Leaves of Grass, which is a poetry collection. Obviously, Song of Myself is in there. Song of Myself, I'm a big fan of that. My book, my first novel, is, the title is from a quote from Song of Myself. So, love Whitman, love the poems in here, just love Song of Myself. So, not a whole lot to say about that, other than it's amazing. Canterbury Tales, again, I mean, like, you know, we're talking about Milton, we're talking about Chaucer, we're going to be talking about Shakespeare. I mean, what is there to say? They are, like, the 3 most important works of some of the most important works of literature. Canterbury Tales, the only reason Canterbury Tales is not in the top 3, and is only 5, is because there are definitely some tales that are just not that good, or that are, like, not done. But as a work of art, just in general, it's so incredible. Um, it's it's like dirty, but then it's also romantic, and then it's these epic heroic quests, and then there's like tales about literally just farting, and it's so all over the place, and it's so impressive. And you read it, and you're like, this is like putting together like a collection of works of like media from today's society, just like going onto like Netflix and being like, I'm gonna just pull some random things, and it's all over the place. I mean, it covers like every type of story, every type of like narrative structure and style and voice, and here it is, this like medieval classic, one of the first major works of English literature, and it's and to be as like relevant today is kind of ridiculous. And then the things they carried by Tim O'Brien, and this is kind of a tough one because is it a novel? Is it short story collection? Is it a memoir? It's kind of all three. The fact is, it has to be on some list, and so it's number 4 here. It's amazing. If you haven't read it, you got to read it. It's just like a bunch of stories about, either about his time in Vietnam or inspired by his time in Vietnam, or that were told to him from other guys that he was in Vietnam with. Just really interesting. And my favorite is the sweetheart of the song Trebong. And I feel like a lot of people, that's their favorite, especially girls. If you don't know, if you haven't read it, go read it when you read that one. But obviously the most famous one is The Man I Killed, because that's what you read in school usually, if you don't read the whole book. And then my last 3, so number 3 is the Griffin and Sabine trilogy, and I don't really know what to classify this as, because, I mean, technically it's just a work of fiction. It is a novel, but it's not, because it's told, and when I say it's in letters, it's not just epistolary. You literally pull the letters off the page. Like you open the page, and there's just an envelope stuck to the page. You open the envelope, you pull the letter out, and they're handwritten letter. I mean, they're not handwritten. They're obviously like mass produced, but handwritten letters against like, and then postcards that are like works of art. And it's a science fiction sort of romance, mystery, like, but it's an interactive book. And so I don't know what you would call it. But it's just, the art's gorgeous and the story's beautiful, and I mean, how many interactive stories are there? Like this level of interactive where you're like, oh, and let me read Griffin and Sabine's letters to one another. So it's really cool. And then Hamlet was number 2. Again, it's Hamlet. Sir Chunk was like, you're only going to have one Shakespeare? And I was like, look, I mean, I could just fill like 50 Shakespeare plays. Okay, I can't because he didn't write 50, but I could have just had a bunch of Shakespeare. I do love Twelfth Night. I love Othello. But I think like Hamlet kind of encompasses it all. And it's number 2 because it's Hamlet. It could be number 1. It's just that, again, this comes down to like personal enjoyment. So for me, it was like, do I love Hamlet more or do I love Moveable Feast more? And it's a really tough one. But I just went with Moveable Feast because like on a personal level, I just relate a little more to like walking around Paris and just, thinking about writing and thinking about life in general. And I love Paris. I like writing. I like Hemingway. So Moveable Feast was just kind of like, felt very relevant, even though it's obviously 100 years old. But a lot of just his explorations of the world and his insights were interesting. Even though it's kind of a little bit of like name dropping, like, look who I know. But yeah, so these were my favorite non-novels, works of whatever. Did I leave something off that you're shocked that is like not included? Maybe it's something I just didn't like. That's the other thing. I haven't read everything, so like, I'm gonna be like, these are my favorite, and there could be like 30 things better that I just never read. So, but these are mine. What do you think? Have you read any of these? Do you like any of these? Sir Chonk was like, oh, it would be more engaging if we can get all the books, but we only own a few of these, and so I was like, I am not gonna like try to pull my bookshelves that are already overflowing in a mess, trying to pull them apart to pull like 10 books out. So I probably will as we get further into like my top 100. I think in like my like top 20 or top 40 or whatever, I'll probably pull them for those, just because I have most of those, but I don't own a lot of these. And so, yeah. So anyway, that was that. And I'm going to come back probably later this week with part 1 of my top 100, and then I'll just slowly work on that. And I know Sir Chunk is wrapping up his like top 50 books of all time, and then he's going to do this kind of thing as well. So yeah, I'm curious just what your thoughts are. All right, bye.